All right, so I have been away from making these recordings for a while. I was away on holidays and I was back and I just sort of procrastinated, got out of the routine of trying to do one at least every day or every other day. So anyways, and in the meantime, of course, I've been thinking about a lot of different things and wishing I had jotted down. But so there's one in particular. I had talked about in the past one, actually during a podcast, about doing something about the difference between knowledge and beliefs, because a lot of people interchange those things. They say, this is what I think, this is what I believe. And they kind of say, in a sense, well, this is my truth. This is the one that I aspire to, or aspire to is the wrong word, but this is because this is what I believe. Until you tell me different, this is what I will consider to be true. And the fact is, when it comes to knowledge, very little of our knowledge do we truly know firsthand. We rely on second-handed sources. We learn it from others. And to some degree, we kind of take their word for it because we trust them, because it's somebody we know, because they have been espoused as some sort of an expert, or because it was a school teacher, things like that. But if you really stop and think about it, and think in terms of, what do you know for sure? And, could those people be mistaken? And then, of course, there are certain things where we don't even think of it in that way. We simply pick a side and decide that that's what we're going to go with. And, at least where my purpose here is to say, at least if we were to acknowledge that we don't really know, but, that this is something that we've decided to hang our hat on. But typically, there's no acknowledgement of that. As a matter of fact, confirmation bias comes in, and when faced with opposing evidence to what we believe, we tend to reject it. And on this sort of related, and this sort of, it's something I thought about doing as a separate one, but the idea of cultural norms as well, in terms of not just knowing, but knowing morally what's right and wrong. And now sometimes cultural norms, i.e. everybody else does it, comes and takes the place. But let me come back to that. So first of all, going back to what we know. Well, if you know certain things firsthand, obvious example, if you burn yourself on a hot stove, you know firsthand that's a bad idea to touch a hot range. If you're gardening and you've tried different things and some things work better than others, you have better firsthand knowledge. Or if you're cooking and you try a certain spice or another spice, probably a better example. Because even with gardening, you might think you've discovered something, whereas maybe you just got lucky. To me, what I try to frame things when I talk about what I know or what I believe, as I try to frame it, not as what I know, but I try to frame it by saying, based on the evidence that I've seen, the experiences I've had, this is what makes the most sense to me at this point, but keeping myself open to the idea that if I am exposed to credible evidence to the contrary, or not necessarily contrary, because sometimes something may not necessarily be right or wrong, but it can be incomplete. You're just getting a piece of the puzzle. It might be the right piece, but it's only one piece of a bigger puzzle. So I try to frame it that way. When we go to cultural norms too, if you look back at things that have happened in the past, one of the obvious examples of where cultural norms, people judge people today because of ancestors generations back that had slaves. Well, cultural norms at that time were, in fact, that slavery was okay, that other races were not the same as others, and it was right. And in fact, back then, you might have been, it just didn't seem like it was, how badly could it be? Because people love looked up to and things like that did it, so it should have been right. I mean, women didn't have the right to vote. And that didn't seem all that outlandish. Matter of fact, around the beginning of even just the 20th century, um, in Britain and Germany and places like that, only the nobles, the landowners, had the right to vote. We don't think about that. Going a little closer, we drove cars without seatbelts. We drove drunk and laughed about it the next day. We packed a bunch of kids in the back of a pickup truck without seatbelts. So many of those things, we didn't think they were horrible. I mean, my mother used to give me cigarettes to go to school with in my lunch because she didn't want me to bum cigarettes from other people. So I stop and think sometimes about, what about cultural norms that we have today that maybe at some point in the future we'll look back and say, oh, that was really weird, because we think now, well, that was in the old days. But I think of, for example, and I apologize, this will offend some people, but the widespread belief in supernatural beings, which is still the vast majority of the population on Earth, to me, just seems like at some point there's no logic behind that. There's no rationale. And yet, probably people listening to this will be immediately taken aback by my even suggesting that that's a cultural norm that doesn't bear true. I also think of, on maybe somewhat less controversial topic, women wearing makeup. And also the whole obsession with women and their worth based on their appearance, and hairstyles and everything else. When you stop and think about the aesthetics industry between hairstyles, hair perms, coloring, makeup, and everything else, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's a cultural norm. And we look at it and we think about it. To me, that is something that in the future may look really strange. I think the widespread use of alcohol is a cultural norm that, we don't think of it. It's legal, but, we talk about abuse, but really the fact that it's so widespread, and that, in fact, if you don't drink, you're either considered to be some sort of person who has strong religious beliefs against it, or that you're a recovering alcoholic, as opposed to, I just don't care for it, or, I don't think it's good for me. So non-drinkers, complete non-drinkers, are really, really the exception to the rule. I remember reading a book by Gretzky where he bragged about having never used drugs, and in the same book talked about celebrating the Stanley Cup with all kinds of champagne. And I remember thinking, well, wait a sec, that's just a legal drug. What's the difference? So those are just some of the things that I think about cultural norms, knowledge, beliefs, things like that. I guess this is both could be under the umbrella of a bigger thing called cognitive biases, in how what we think we know or what we believe, and how we haven't really defined knowledge, beliefs, cultural norms, mores versus actual right and wrong. Anyways, bit of rambling maybe on this, but hopefully of some interest. Subscribing to the YouTube channel is greatly appreciated. For now.